This is the last passage in the first section, so let's read the blurb. Passage 1 is adapted from Christina Eisenberg, The Carnivore Way, Coexisting with and Conserving North America's Predators. Passage 2 is adapted from John R. Squirrel, Missing Links and Trophic Cascades in Food Webs, a reply to Ripple. A trophic cascade, so they're defining a term, occurs when the presence of a predator decreases the population of its prey, thereby increasing the numbers of organisms at the next lower trophic level. So in passage 1, they start by saying that in the early 2000s, wolves began to drift down from Canada into Washington state. This natural wolf recolonization inspired ecologists such as William Ripple and his colleague to conduct an exercise in scientific thinking to consider the potential impacts that an apex predator like the wolf would have on the intricate workings of the lynx snowshoe hare food web. So right now we can know that the wolf is basically on top. Somewhere below is going to be a lynx, and the lynx looks like preys on the snowshoe hare. At the time, Washington had low hare and lynx populations, so we'll just make a note of that, and a high coyote population. Coyotes had recently expanded their range and abundance. Wolves prey on coyotes. So we'll put coyotes here. What if the wolf's return to the Pacific Northwest could indirectly improve lynx conservation via trophic cascades effects? So based on what they're saying in the first paragraph, that kind of makes sense because the wolf was gone, now the wolf returns. That's going to increase the coyotes, who likely somehow affects the lynx and snowshoe hare. They don't actually give that relationship clearly until line 16, wolf, coyote, lynx, snowshoe hare. And then they explain it more in detail starting in line 16. First, by killing coyotes, wolves would reverse the mesopredator release that had occurred when wolves had been extirpated from this region. So what does that mean? If wolves kill coyotes, it's going to reverse this release that had occurred when wolves were gone or taken away. When humans hunted wolves to extinction, they removed an important check that's like a restriction on coyote numbers, creating a release, so they're defining what they mean now, on the numbers of this mid-sized predators. So basically without wolves, the number of coyotes had increased, which put more pressure on lynx via competition for food resources such as snowshoe hares. So right here they're telling us that lynx eat snowshoe hares, but there's also competition between coyotes and lynx, which apparently also eat snowshoe hares. 26, what does that mean? Therefore, by reducing coyotes, a returning wolf population could indirectly create ecological benefits for the lynx, which also makes sense because more wolves, less coyotes helps the lynx because they're not being eaten by them. The researchers further hypothesized that because coyotes prey on lynx, a reduction in the number of coyotes by wolves would release the predation pressure on lynx. The next paragraph talks about the second mechanism that affects this whole relationship, because remember, the assertion in line 15 was that there are two mechanisms that would drive that relationship. So now we're going to talk about the second one. So it says, in Western North America, south of the US-Canada border, wolves primarily prey on elk and deer. So I'm going to write wolf here, and they prey on elk and deer. When elk and deer numbers are high, these herbivores can suppress shrubs by heavy browsing. So it looks like they both eat shrubs. Ripple and his colleagues hypothesized that the wolf's return would reduce elk and deer numbers. Makes sense, more wolves, less elk and deer, and also change their behavior as have been found in places like Yellowstone by John Wandrett and others. So how is their behavior changed? It says, elk and deer need to stay alert in order to survive in the areas where wolves exist. This means keeping their heads up and spending less time standing in one spot with their heads down, as they typically do when there are no wolves in a system. So then the main point is line 45 to 46. Via this predation risk mechanism, wolves could indirectly reduce browsing pressure on shrubs, which would improve snowshoe hare habitat, thereby benefiting lynx. So that's actually the connection between the two mini charts that we drew. So that makes sense because if wolves are reintroduced, elk and deer decrease, shrubs increase. This actually helps the hares because they live there. And so if there's more hares living comfortably, what's going to happen? The lynx are going to have more food to eat. So that's what the point is in lines 46 to 48. Now at this point, you should be doing all the questions from passage 1, and then once you're done with those, move on to read passage 2, then do all the questions that deal with passage 2, and only at the very end deal with the questions that consider both passage 1 and 2 together. Here I'm going to go through passage 2 first just to keep them together. So passage 2 says, Ripple and others correctly state that wolves can affect coyotes both behaviorally and ecologically, and that such regulation can have cascading effects. So this is kind of a restatement of the idea that Ripple had said, which was summarized very nicely in passage 1. However, and this is going to be passage 2's claim, despite well-publicized initial declines in coyote abundance in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, coyotes may now be adapting to wolves and coyote pack numbers may have rebounded. So by introducing wolves, they expected the coyote numbers to go down. Passage 2 is saying that's actually not what happened. Coyotes have actually adapted to wolves and their numbers have rebounded, meaning to say that they went up. The trophic strength of wolf effects on coyotes may also differ geographically. So basically these are two ways in which Ripple's original claim is not exactly right or limited. The inverse relationship between the wolves and coyotes, meaning as one went up, the other goes down, is not supported outside the two national parks, Yellowstone and Grand Teton. In other systems where wolves and coyotes and lynx coexist, research shows a positive relationship between wolves and coyotes, whereby coyotes benefit from scavenging on wolf-killed ungulate carcasses. So I guess that means coyotes can also then eat wolves who die, so that's why their relationship can be more direct. In other words, as one goes up, the other might go up. As one goes down, the other might go down. Next, she's going to give proof of this. She says the generally low mortality rates of radio-collared coyotes killed by wolves is 3 times less than those killed by cougars. So here they're introducing another predator that's near the top, who apparently also preys on coyotes. So we'll just write cougars there, and we'll put an arrow there because they eat coyotes. And then she summarizes, thus this quick review of the literature suggests that the strongest generality of Ripple's hypothesis that wolves have a direct negative effect on coyotes is at best inconsistent. So Ripple's hypothesis is inconsistent both within that region and across North America. So at this point, you know that the whole passage is probably going to be a challenge to Ripple's ideas. In the next paragraph, she says, Buskirk hypothesized that coyotes compete with lynx through interference competition and indirect exploitative competition for shared food. So this was mentioned in passage 1 in 24 to 25 when they talked about the coyotes actually compete with lynx. And here, passage 2 is giving 2 ways in which that happened. Interference competition 1 and competition for shared food resources number 2. Specifically, that's probably the snowshoe hare. And then she continues to critique Ripple. She says, Ripple speculated that these interactions are in part responsible for the imperiled status of southern lynx. Unfortunately, and here's her point, evidence for interference competition is essentially limited to anecdotal observations, meaning to say that only probably a few people saw this. Anecdotal is like stories. And then she says, an observation of a single juvenile lynx killed by a coyote in the Yukon is not prima facie at first sight evidence for trophic level interaction. So she's basically saying you can't point to one or a few cases and make generalizations. And then she concludes line 92, direct interaction between coyotes and lynx were actually rare. So in a very general sense, passage 1 is kind of just outlining and explaining Ripple's theory. Passage 2 is talking about the limitations of Ripple's theory and saying that it's probably, for the most part, not true. Question 43. One important function of the first paragraph in passage 1 is to. So keep in mind they are asking one important function, not necessarily the main purpose of paragraph 1. So we'll look over passage 1. Remember what she's basically saying is that the wolves began to come down from Canada into Washington state, William Ripple and his colleagues wanted to investigate the impacts that that predator would have. Then they talk about the general population, and the question that they're asking is, what if the wolf's return to the Pacific Northwest could indirectly improve lynx conservation via trophic cascade effects? So let's look at the answers. A. Assert that the strength of the assumptions that inform the hypothesis that Ripple and his colleagues developed. So there really wasn't a mention of a hypothesis, there was really just a question. And even if there was, they didn't talk about how strong the assumptions were. So A is out. B, describe the ecological situation that Ripple and his colleagues considered. So B is a definite possibility because they do say what was going on, what the populations were. C, define important concepts that Ripple and his colleagues employed in their research. They do mention in the very last line the trophic cascade effect, but they actually don't define that until the following paragraph. So C is not likely. D, compare behavioral traits of animals that Ripple and his colleagues studied. So they don't really get into behavioral traits just yet in that paragraph. So the best answer is B. Question 44, as used in line 16, drive most nearly means. So let's read from line 15. Ripple and his colleagues hypothesized that two mechanisms would drive the wolf, coyote, lynx, snowshoe, hare trophic cascades. And then he talks about what those mechanisms are. Killing coyotes would do this, and then the second one in line 33. Two mechanisms would drive those cascades. You're probably looking for a word like cause, because these are the two ways that it happened. Two mechanisms would create those cascades. Two mechanisms would affect those cascades, meaning to cause. So in this case, if you had guessed cause, that's one of the answers. So that one is probably right. Going through the other choices, convey. So if you were to say two mechanisms convey something, that would really mean convey as in showing something, but it would imply that it was already there. If they're saying the mechanism actually causes something to happen, that means it wasn't there in the first place. So convey is not the best choice. Two mechanisms operate those effects. Again, kind of just an odd use of the word operate. Operate doesn't necessarily mean to cause. It would probably mean in a certain sense to control in some way. D, repulse. Repulse means to drive away, so that's completely off, and the answer is A. Number 45. Passage 1 indicates that Ripple and his colleagues would expect to find in areas where wolves have returned elk and deer. So remember that in the passage, elk and deer were mentioned here in line 35, and we know that wolves prey on them. Line 37 says, Ripple and his colleagues hypothesized that the wolves' return would reduce elk and deer numbers. That's number 1. And also, number 2, change their behavior. What specifically? It says, line 41, elk and deer need to stay alert in order to survive in areas where wolves exist. This means keeping their heads up, spending less time standing in one spot. Line 45, via this predation risk mechanism, wolves could indirectly reduce browsing pressure on shrubs, which would improve the snowshoe hare habitat, thereby benefiting lynx. So a bunch of stuff going on. Let's go through the answer choices and see which one they're focusing on. Choice A, elk and deer would feed on fewer varieties of shrubs than do elk and deer in areas where no wolves are found. So there was no mention of fewer varieties of shrubs. The only thing that we could safely say is that if wolves have returned, elk and deer may feed on fewer shrubs, but not fewer varieties. So A is out. B, exist in lower numbers than they did prior to the local extermination of wolves. Well, it did say that the wolf's return would reduce elk and deer numbers, but this part about local extermination of wolves totally makes this answer wrong because there was no mention of that. Choice C, graze for shorter periods without interruption than they did before the return of the wolves. So this makes sense. Going back to line 41 where it says they need to stay alert in order to survive in areas where wolves would exist means keeping their head up and spending less time standing in one spot with their heads down as they typically do when there are no wolves. So it makes sense that if wolves are around who are their predators, they would have to graze for shorter periods of time. So we'll keep C. Choice D, demonstrate less fearful behavior toward coyotes than toward wolves. No mention of coyotes, so really you just can't say, and we'll cross out D. So the best answer is C. Question 46. Which choice from passage 2 best supports the idea that findings about the effect of wolves on coyotes in some locations may not be representative of the effects of wolves on coyotes in all locations? So basically they're saying, where's the evidence that what happens in one area is not representative of all the other areas? And basically we just have to go through each answer choice. So choice A, lines 49 to 53. Line 49, Ripple and others correctly state that wolves can affect coyotes, so we do have the right topic, both behaviorally and ecologically in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, as shown by Berger and Geese, and that such regulation can have cascading effects. So again, no mention about other locations and whether you can generalize from this location. So we're going to cross out choice A. B, lines 53 to 57. However, despite the well-publicized initial declines in coyote abundance in the GYE following wolf recovery, coyotes may now be adapting to wolves and coyote pack numbers may have rebounded. Again, nothing here about whether this occurrence applies to larger areas. So we'll cross out choice B. Choice C, 61 to 64. The inverse relationship between wolves and coyotes in Yellowstone is not supported outside the two national parks included in the analyses by Berger and Geese. So yeah, that does seem to answer the question because it says what happened in Yellowstone Park is not supported outside of those two parks. So for now, C looks like it's the right answer, but we'll check D, 78 to 81. Buskirk and others hypothesize that coyotes compete with lynx through both interference and competition and indirect exploitative competition for shared food resources. So again, here, nothing about whether this idea can be generalized to other areas. So we're going to cross out choice D, and C is our answer. Question 47. The authors of passage 2 provide information about coyote mortality rates in northwest Montana, most likely 2. So let's look at the passage again. So Montana is mentioned starting in line 69. The low mortality rates of radio-collared coyotes killed by wolves outside of Yellowstone in northwest Montana is 3 times less than those killed by cougars. So what is the significance of that? Keep reading. Thus, a quick review of the literature suggests that the strongest generality of Ripple's hypothesis that wolves have a direct negative effect on coyotes is at best inconsistent. So they're saying that because outside of Yellowstone Park in Montana, there are very few coyotes killed by wolves. Therefore, Ripple's hypothesis that wolves directly have a negative effect on coyotes is probably not true. That's the main idea. So let's go through the answer choices. Choice A, offer an alternative explanation for coyote declines in the greater Yellow ecosystem. This would be very speculative. We don't know if there are cougars also in the greater Yellow ecosystem, but the main reason why A is wrong is because that's not the actual purpose of mentioning the low coyote mortality rates. The purpose is to really say that Ripple's theory was wrong. B, emphasize the strength of the wolf-caused trophic cascade in the area. This would be actually saying the opposite because Ripple is the one arguing for the trophic cascade, meaning more wolves, less coyotes, whereas passage 2 is saying that's not true. C, illustrate the claim that the presence of wolves can indirectly benefit coyotes. Choice C, illustrate the claim that the presence of wolves can indirectly benefit coyotes. That would be a stretch because there's no evidence that the presence of wolves can benefit coyotes. All they're really saying is that in the northwest Montana region, they're not killed as much by wolves, but presumably they're still killed by them. So C is not likely the answer. D, support the claim that wolves may not always pose a major direct threat. That is the safest answer because again, if we're saying that they die or they're killed by wolves at only 1/3 the rate or the amount that they are in the Yellowstone ecosystem, then yeah, they may not always pose a direct threat and they're getting killed by cougars. So choice D is the best answer. Question 48, in line 81, the authors of passage 2 use the word shared to indicate that coyotes and lynx, let's go back to the passage, start at line 78. Buskirk hypothesized that coyotes compete with lynx through, remember these are the two ways, both interference competition, where they kill each other, and indirect exploitative competition for shared food resources. So what do they mean if there's competition for shared food resources? Obviously the coyotes and lynx are not saying, oh, here, you take some of my food. No, you take some of mine. What they're talking about is that they're eating the same thing. So looking at the answer choice, choice A, have some overlap in their diets. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Choice B, will sometimes feed together. Again, not the meaning of shared in that case. C, are both preyed upon by wolves. Really hard to say. I don't know. But when they say shared competition for shared food resources, they're talking about what they eat, not necessarily who eats them. So we'll cross out C. D, may scavenge each other's prey. Scavenge is where one person is eating something, then they're done with it, and then the other person comes by and takes the leftovers or whatever's remaining. Again, nothing mentioned about that, so we'll cross out D, and A is the answer. Question 49. Which choice best describes the relationship between the passages? So remember, passage 1 is basically talking about Ripple's theory. Passage 2 is basically saying he's not right. Let's go through the answer choices. Choice A. Passage 2 presents information that challenges aspects of the hypothesis described in passage 1. So yeah, that seems about right. They talk about the areas outside of the Yellowstone Park and how it doesn't match up with what Ripple was saying. So we'll keep choice A. B. Passage 2 casts doubt on the authenticity of the data supporting the hypotheses offered in passage 1. So notice that A and B are slightly different. Passage 2 is not saying that the data or the information or the numbers is not authentic or is not trustworthy. Passage 2 is basically saying that the data actually contradicts the hypothesis. So B is out. C. Passage 2 argues for the need for modifications to the hypothesis. Again, I think it's more closer that passage 2 is just saying that it doesn't match up. There was really no part in the whole passage where it said, oh, let's modify this theory. You can check line 75, which actually just says that the theory is inconsistent. So we'll cross that out. Choice D. Passage 2 discusses a study intended to test parts of the hypothesis presented in passage 1. There was no mention of a study in passage 2. If you look it over, what you'll find is that passage 2 is getting their information from a literature review, but they don't really discuss a single study, and there's no indication that the study was intended to test parts of the hypothesis. They mentioned literature review in line 73 if you wanted to look. And that leaves choice A. Question 50. Based on the passages, Ripple and his colleagues and the authors of passage 2 would likely agree with which statement about wolves and coyotes? So just keep in mind that Ripple and passage 2 generally disagree about their relationship, but we're looking for something that they both agree on. Choice A. Wolves and coyotes typically occupy the same trophic level in an ecosystem. I would say definitely not passage 1, because passage 1 is talking about that hierarchy and the inverse relationship, so we'll cross out A. B. It's possible for wolves to initiate trophic cascades through their effects on coyotes. Definitely passage 1, possibly passage 2 also, and if you're unsure about this, we can look at lines 60 to 61. So notice in 61, this is where the author is making his point that what happened in Yellowstone is not supported outside, but he does say the inverse relationship between wolves and coyotes in Yellowstone is not supported outside the 2 national parks. Regardless, the fact that he's saying that the inverse relationship kind of does happen in Yellowstone means that choice B is still probably the safest answer. So for now, we'll keep choice B. And also keep in mind, it's the least extreme. When they say something like it is possible, chances are both passages are going to agree, but don't take that as a rule. Choice C. There are some circumstances in which the presence of wolves may benefit coyotes. Definitely not passage 1, because remember, passage 1 is focused on that inverse relationship. Wolves will always eat the coyotes. D. Wolves and coyotes can have both ecological and behavioral effects on large herbivores. That was in the last paragraph in passage 1, but passage 2 really kind of silent on that. So we'll cross out D, and B is the best choice. Question 51. The authors of passage 2 suggest that the hypothesis described in lines 28 to 32 is, so first let's look at what that hypothesis is. 28 to 32, let's read it. The researchers further hypothesized that because coyotes also prey on lynx, a reduction of coyote numbers by wolves would release predation pressure on the lynx. So that does make sense given our hierarchy that we showed. If you reduce the number of wolves, the number of coyotes should increase. That's basically what it's saying. So let's quickly go through the answers, but not too much because keep in mind there's an evidence question next. Choice A, contradicted by anecdotal observations. Remember that passage 2 doesn't like anecdotal observations. They were basically saying there wasn't enough data to support Ripple's theory and you can't rely on anecdotal observations. If you want to know, that's in line 85, but not likely choice A. Choice B, valid for many populations but not for all. That seems like a safe thing to say because that was the whole point of passage 2, that what happened in the Yellowstone Park could not be reproduced or was not seen anywhere else. Choice C, difficult to test in a natural setting. I think it's more about whether it's observable, not so much testing, but we'll keep it around just in case. D, based on insufficient data. D is okay. I don't know if you would say that it's insufficient data. I think passage 2 would say that the data actually contradicts the hypothesis that we just read. But regardless, we'll go to the evidence. So 52. Which choice best provides the evidence for the answer? So keep in mind, we're looking for evidence that shows that passage 2 would probably not agree with that hypothesis, or regardless, we're looking for evidence that shows whatever passage 2's opinion is about that hypothesis. So it's a few different levels of thinking to think about. Just keep that in mind. Choice A, 65 to 68. Let's take a look at it. 65. In other systems where wolves, coyotes, and lynx coexist, research shows a positive relationship between wolves and coyotes, whereby coyotes benefit from scavenging on wolf-killed ungulate carcasses. So this choice seems okay because this is an example of other areas where the hypothesis in those lines don't exactly work. So we'll hold on to it for now. Choice B, lines 69 to 72. The generally low mortality rates of radio-collared coyotes killed by wolves outside of Yellowstone is 3 times less than those killed by cougars. So 69 to 72 is kind of the same thing as choice A. Again, these are talking about the same example, and you could argue that this shows how the rule is not applied. Neither of these really show how the rule does work in another area, but we'll keep them for now. Choice C, 82 to 84. Start at 82. It says, Ripple speculated that these interactions are in part responsible for the imperiled status of southern lynx. So this is talking about mostly coyotes and lynx, not really dealing with wolves, so not related. We'll cross out choice C for sure. Choice D, 86 to 88. 86, an observation of a single juvenile lynx killed by a coyote in the Yukon is not prima facie evidence of a trophic level interaction. So what is this basically saying? You can't use one example and generalize from that. And again, if we're going to match choice D with choice B, that seems like the best match because choice B is saying something that's valid for many populations is not necessarily valid for all. So choice D seems like the best match with choice B. Again, choice A and B possibly could illustrate that, but not. It's not as closely tied to any of these answers as choice D is. So we'll go with D.